Hello, welcome everyone to Basic Income Field Experiment class, week 4. Okay, we begin next with chapter 11 on why experiments can't resolve most of the public disagreement about UBI. The biggest problem there is that most of the disagreement is ethical. Part of the disagreement has to do with things that we can't observe in experiments, but I think the biggest thing has to do with most of it being ethical. It's not like it's not like a test for a vaccine where if you know it's safe and effective, you'd want to take it. If you doubt that it's safe and effective, you probably wouldn't want to take it. It's not like global warming, where if we actually are killing the environment that sustains us, we definitely want to stop doing that. The people who are against vaccines and who are against global warming feel strongly compelled to doubt all the evidence in its favor. But the people who are opposed to basic income don't need to doubt the evidence. They just need to have their own moral opinion on Anu Sharuti, could you please turn your video off until you're ready to speak? Thanks. So we have an issue where no matter how much we learn universal basic income, we are always going to have ethical disagreement about it, almost certainly. And experiments will help, even if no matter how much they can help us learn, are very unlikely to resolve that disagreement. The faulty assumptions that go into the belief that UBI will resolve everything are, when you think about what they are, really blatantly false. First, that people disagree about UBI primarily because they disagree about its effects. Second, that evidence about those effects is lacking. And third, experiments can provide that missing evidence. All three of those assumptions are clearly false. People disagree not primarily because they disagree about its likely effects. They disagree primarily because of its known effects, the fact that it can relieve poverty for everyone, whether or not they work, are well known to both sides, and they disagree whether that's a good idea. Now, evidence about the most important, there is lacking evidence, but evidence about its most important effects, I don't believe is lacking. I think the more you know about UBI, the more likely you are to have made up your mind about it. And what evidence is missing can't primarily be provided by experiments. So having an experiment isn't driven by a belief that we're going to resolve the debate. Most of the things that experiments can show, we already have a pretty good idea about. And the things that we really don't know about UBI are things that experiments can't provide the answer. So the evidence from a UBI experiment is only likely to sway someone in the middle, someone who's probably not very aware of existing evidence, and also probably somebody who is more likely to be swayed by who wins the spin wars than by what evidence is found by a new experiment. So you got to wonder, what is the value of an experiment? Should we go on a campaign to get people to better understand the existing evidence rather than a campaign? And we can also be sure that experiments won't provide evidence strong enough to discredit either side or to persuade people who have strong ethical beliefs on the related issues to change their mind. But it might sway people in the middle, but spin is more likely to do that. That's really all there is to it for chapter 11 on why experiments can't resolve these issues. Yet, despite the fact that experiments can't answer the big question about UBI, should we do it? People will look to experiments for that answer. People want experiments to provide them a good, simple answer. Should we do it or not? And because experiments are incapable of doing that on their own, they're only capable of adding a little bit to the knowledge we have about experiments. Because they're only capable about that, what I suggest in chapter 12 is that experiments need to be aware of that people are looking for an answer to this bottom line question. Should we do it or shouldn't we? That's what people are looking for in an experiment. And that's one thing an experiment cannot provide. So experimenters have to make that really clear. They have to relate, and the way that they need to make that clear, I argue, is by relating everything to that bottom line. Now, so they got to think about what is the bottom line and why is it that they can't answer it. One is the ethical issue, is that the bottom line is morally loaded. It depends on your ethical belief. So for that aspect of it, they need to discuss what the findings mean for people with these ethical beliefs and what the findings mean for these ethical beliefs, but also how conclusive they are. I think worse than not relating things to the bottom line is pretending that the results are more conclusive than they are about what they say about the bottom line. That's the way spin usually works, is that people find some tiny shred of evidence in an experiment or something like this. And then they take that evidence and say, oh, well, this says we can't do it, or this says we have to do it. That's the hasty generalization. And that's a very bad thing to do with the results. It is the job of researchers who are writing about experiments not only to avoid doing that themselves, but also to head off possibilities that other people are doing. And I suggest then to try to be a little more neutral in understanding the bottom line, is to phrase it as a cost effectiveness question. And in the book, I use this wording exactly. Is a fully implemented national UBI a cost-effective method to benefit people in the short and long run in the ways UBI supporters claim it does, assuming cost effectiveness is judged relative to other methods of achieving similar benefits for the same people? That is the cost effectiveness question. That, however, leaves open the idea of, well, for a lot of things that people say, that supporters say UBI will do, will only happen if we have a big, very generous UBI. And we might not be testing as a UBI that's big enough to do all of these things. And so we might need a cost effectiveness question for a more incremental test of UBI. So I suggest this: what policy, whether it's basic income or anything else, produces the greatest increase in recipients' welfare per unit of cost in the context of a long-term, fully implemented national policy? Those are sort of the bottom line questions. And those, all of the other questions, really all of the other questions relate to that. And I think that researchers need to be honest about that. That's the bottom line. And what they're finding makes only a small contribution to understanding one of those bottom lines. Now, the way I've framed those bottom lines, it relieves some of the morally loaded questions that go into the decision to have a UBI or not. However, it doesn't eliminate all of them. And there's very little that experiments can do about that. Why do I think a bottom line question is so important? I say that because research should be in the help to understand. It's what we really want to know. And therefore, we need to relate what we're finding to the things we really want to know. It is the reason that citizens and policymakers want an experiment. Citizens and policymakers are not only hoping for this answer, but they're really expecting it. When you read non-academic articles about basic income experiments, you can tell that people who don't know much about this are almost always expecting, does it pass? Does it fail? Will it tell us if basic income makes sense? Things that experiments are incapable of doing. So people have these overblown expectations that their bottom line answer is going to be asked, their bottom line question is going to be answered. And so we need to show we're aware of this bottom line question, and we're showing this is the tiny shred of evidence that we have toward the answer to that question. And this is why it falls short. This is what else we would need to know to get the answer to that question. So they need to relate findings to it by discussing the bottom line, by discussing how does this piece of research improve our understanding of the bottom line. And they have to avoid the hasty generalization. You can't just say, oh, we found a good thing. That means that's an indication that we should do it. Or we found a bad thing. That means we shouldn't do it. That is a hasty generalization. It's all part of many other things. This little shred of evidence, the control group did this, the experimental group did that. How is that likely to play out on a national scale? How does that compare with all the things we can't measure? We need to fight, we the researchers need to fight the street light effect by calling attention not just to the parts of the issue that are lit up by this street light that we shine with this basic income experiment, but to all the dark parts as well. We have to point out that, yes, we learned this, but these are all these things that we don't know, and all of those things are just as important, maybe as important as what we know. People will not understand what UBI experiments show unless they understand the limits of those. We've got to be real honest that these experiments have big limits. So another thing that I discussed in this chapter is the need for issue-specific bottom line. That we don't just need one bottom line question for the whole experiment, we need that, but also in order to get to that question, we need to look, well, what is the bottom line for any variable that we're interested in? No one has a direct interest in raw comparisons between experimental control groups. No one directly cares about that. They care about that only if it's an indication of what's going to happen nationally if we actually introduce it. So our interest is in the full impact of the actual policy for any relevant variable. That is, we want to know the relevant cost, the relative cost effectiveness for any variable that we study. Then we think about, well, how do we take our evidence and get it closer to that bottom line. And there are 4 ways that I know of. One is by bringing in theory and evidence from other sources and then using it in a microsimulation. That's one. Number 2, using theory and data from other sources, but on some issue where a micro simulation isn't appropriate, and simply have a qualitative discussion of how this new piece of evidence that we found in these experiments goes together with these other pieces of evidence that we have from other kinds of ways to gather knowledge about UBI, such as similar policies in the past. Combine those things, those efforts, and then have a qualitative discussion. Another way is to discuss the differences between what you found and what you really want to know about UBI. How are they different? And how are they likely to be different? How is the outcome likely to be similar or different than what you found? And another important, even when you combine the information that we have, the information that we have found from this test, plus the information that we have available from other sources, we combine those with our best quantitative or qualitative way to combine those. Even then, we will fall short of a full knowledge of what UBI is going to do, and in ways that might be decisive for some people. And in that case, we need to discuss what other information we would need to get closer. What other information is still missing to tell what's likely to happen with a fully implemented national UBI. Okay, that is the end of chapter 12. Do I have any questions on chapter 12? Okay, Felix?
Yes, I do have a question, just a little one. You were mentioning microsimulations. Is there a difference between microsimulations and experiments, or like just to make that clear to me?
Oh yeah, simulation is tells you that it's not an experiment. Is that an experiment is you bring in real people and you don't simulate what the real people are doing. You actually observe real people and what they actually do. You might observe them in a laboratory setting, or you might observe them in the real world setting, but you're observing the actions of real people. In a microsimulation, you are creating a computer model where you make a bunch of assumptions about how humans would behave, and then using the computer as a substitute for millions of people and how they are behaving. Even a lab experiment is very different from a simulation. In simulations, when I put it that way, they don't use real people. All they use is these assumptions about how real people behave. That makes microsimulations sound really inferior. However, they can be very good. They are as good or as bad as your assumptions about how humans behave, humans and other institutions. And if you have good information, if what you're plugging into the simulation is good econometric data that has been gained from the best sources that we have over all the years that we've been observing it, it's possible that you can get a microsimulation that is very useful. Most airplane pilots fly a simulator before they fly a real plane. And if that didn't help you learn to fly planes, we'd probably have a lot more dead pilots dead pilots in training than we do now. We probably stopped using the simulator. So simulators can work if they're programmed right, and the workings of the whole economy are, in fact, more complicated than the workings of an airplane. So it is, and there's a lot more unknown to plug in there. It is a difficult thing, very different than experiments, but the advantage of them is that they can do things that experiments can't do. Experiments can find new parameters about humans behave, but only in narrow areas that they're able to observe. Simulations, if you've observed people behaving in certain ways in other areas, like when the wage goes up, people work this much more, or when the wage goes up, employers want to hire this many fewer people, something like that. These kind of things, if you've got good data like that, you can put these into a simulation where you can't put them into an experiment.
All right, thank you.
Okay, does that answer your question, Felix? Okay, before you go, Felix, I have another question for you, and really for the whole class. In this room that I'm in, I'm getting a pretty bad echo. Can you hear the echo, and how bad is it? Felix, what do you think?
I don't hear any echo, but sometimes the connection is a bit like unstable, I would say. But I can understand what you're saying.
Okay, that's good, because I'm glad it's not picking up the echo. That makes a huge difference. Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, Felix. Anybody else? Any on the opinion? And there's nothing really I can do about the connection. Anybody else with an opinion on the echo? All right. Okay, so let me go on to the next chapter. Okay, so chapter 13. Chapter 13 is two long lists about the claims made by supporters and opponents with explanations of what they are. So I'm not gonna all I could really do with this chapter would be to read through the list and explain each of the claims on this list. I'm not gonna do that. I think just lists are just hard to remember. They don't get into your head. So look over these. Get out your book and look over it. Notice that the claims made by supporters are 2.5 pages. They start here, they go all through here, and they end here. Claims made by supporters. And then claims made by opponents start here and go here. So that's like 1.5 pages. Now, look through those. You've read the chapters already, but look through those and think about, are there any that you have questions on? I try to write them in a way that's completely understandable. So hopefully you'll already understand them, but ask me any questions if you don't understand what the claim is. Now, the testability of the claim I discussed in the next 3 chapters. So you don't need to ask me anything about testing these claims. That's coming up. But just about, do you understand what I mean by the claim? A couple of caveats while you're thinking about questions. One is that this is not an exhaustive list. This is a list that I came up with. I thought of everything I could think of. Then I got on social media with my contacts who are into basic income. And I asked them what other claims should be on this list. And I got some good claims that I hadn't thought of, some good ideas that people say that I hadn't really thought of. I got my friends to contribute more claims, and they contributed more claims. And through that sort of crowdsourcing, I came up with this list of claims. There are probably other things that I should have put on there that I didn't think of at the time. Only one of them I thought of as I was rereading it to prepare for the class, which is I should have divided the poverty claim into 2. Because one poverty claim we don't need a test for because it's true by definition. But another one, how much will a UBI of this size reduce poverty? That claim is very different than the one that a UBI of a sufficient size will definitely eliminate poverty. And I should have included them both, but I didn't. We can deal with that one ad hoc. But is there anything on this list, these two lists, any claim on these two lists that you all have a question about? Just go ahead and put your hand up. Okay, Niharika, what's your question?
Hello. So my question is about the consumerism claim. So it says that UBI is like being a cash grant, but I don't understand why it has to be a cash grant.
Oh, that's in the definition of UBI.
But today, like with the digital economy being digital, it could also be like directly transferred, right? And like does not need to be a cash grant.
Oh, that is cash. Digital currency is cash.
Okay, I see. I get it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but still, I did not understand.
Digital currency is a form of cash. When I mean not in cash, I mean instead of giving you money of some kind, a currency, we are going to give you. Okay, you need a house, you need food, you need heat, you need clothing. We're going to issue those things to you instead of giving you money with which you can buy them. That is a non-cash grant. That's an in-kind grant. And UBI is defined as cash grant, which is in whatever form of currency, whether it's paper money, checks, digital, whatever form of coins, whatever form of currency is appropriate.
Okay, got it. And also, I did not understand why it would lead to environmental destruction.
Well, because people can buy stuff with it, and people might buy things. So people at the low end of the income distribution, and that could be 40, 50, 60% of the population. People at the low end of the income distribution are going to have more money to spend. And they might spend that money on things that degrade the environment.
But in that case, it could also be that if they have more money, they could probably opt for sustainable products that maybe don't.
Right, they could. We don't know. There is a claim about that too. There's two opposing claims on that it will lead to more consumerism and less consumerism. Both are plausible. Both are plausible, and that's why both of them are on different lists. And we do not know which is true. And as I explained in the following chapter, experiments aren't really going to help.
Okay, got it. And I also did not understand the capture claim. Could you elaborate more on that?
Sure. In many programs that are meant for the poor or meant for some particular target group, they often end up benefiting someone else. So let's say that we have a program that is supposed to provide money for the truly needy, and we then hire a bunch of people truly provide money and coaching and help for the people who are truly needy, coaching and physical. So we not only give money to the poor, but we also hire a bunch of people to speak to the poor, to find out exactly what their needs are, to coach them into performing better in the market, and to maybe make their programs conditional on them behaving better in the market. Now, it is possible that a lot of the money that was really intended for the poor is going to end up going and benefiting this group of people we hire to do that job. So they have captured some of the benefits. That's not the only way it can happen. Suppose we want to help the poor by giving them a basic income, and then the landlords raise the rent. So the people actually, and to say their rent goes up by the same amount as the basic income. In that case, the landlord has captured all of the benefits that were meant to go to the people. The people were supposed to have an extra $1,000 a month. Instead, they get an extra $1,000 a month and give an extra $1,000 a month to their landlord. The landlord has captured the benefit. Now, but in that case, the landlord is capturing the entire benefit, but it's entirely possible for the landlord to capture only some of the benefit. That kind of stuff does happen, especially with conditional programs that have large overhead costs. And then you get a large constituency within the bureaucracy that wants to keep the bureaucracy going. Sorry, I don't know why that went off. But that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Okay, any other questions? Okay, great. I don't see any other hands up with questions on these claims, so I'll go on to the next chapter. Okay, that's chapter 14, claims that don't need a test. I identified, out of these two lists, I identified, oh, Miriam's raised her hand. Okay, before I go on. Okay, sorry, not Miriam, Maria. Maria, you raised your hand. Please ask your question.
Oh, yes, Professor, I raised my hand. Actually, I'm not sure about this claim, the bot of proletarian claim. Can you please elaborate a little bit?
Yes. Okay. A lot of people believe that in order to really change the dynamic of inequality that we have in the world, it is not enough to reform capitalism, but we need to get rid of capitalism and have some other social system, some form of socialism or something that none of us have envisioned. That real fundamental change, and often they will say that basic income is not that real big fundamental change. The basic income is, it's helping people at the low end, but it is not a fundamental change that say it would be to nationalize industries and things like that. And what they argue is if you alleviate the suffering of people at the bottom, you're sort of buying them off with these little tidbits. So they end up getting the equivalent of the Roman bread and circuses. You know the story of the Roman Empire when they started giving free games at the Colosseum and free food to Roman plebeians in order to keep them from rebelling. People are just getting little tidbits that the capitalists are willing to give them, but they're then less likely to overthrow capitalism and create true fundamental reform. That's the argument. I don't necessarily have great sympathy with that argument, but that is the argument.
Thank you.
Okay. Next thing is claims that do not need a test. It's chapter 14, claims that don't need a test. I identified 5 claims out of these 2 big long lists of claims that really don't need a test at all to know whether it's true or false. The efficient transfer claim, the poverty claim, the freedom claim, the compensation claim, and the reciprocity or work ethic claim. It is true that a UBI is an efficient lump sum grant. That we know is true by definition. It is the same dollar amount, the same euro amount given to every citizen. It gives them no incentive to change their behavior in order to get the grant. Therefore, it's efficient. It will have income effects, but it has no substitution effects. And that is the key of an in-kind, of an efficient transfer. Now, only the grant is efficient. The taxes used to keep this grant from causing rampant inflation are not necessarily efficient. They might be. There are some efficient taxes out there that could be used to counteract the inflationary effects of UBI, such as a land value tax, a resource value tax, rent taxes, and stuff like that. Whether those taxes would be enough to counteract the inflationary effects of UBI, I do not know. But the grant itself is efficient. The taxes aren't necessarily efficient, but the test can't, the experiment can't test the effects of the taxes. So that one doesn't need a test for everything we can know about. The poverty claim. If you set UBI at the poverty line, it will eliminate poverty. Poverty is people who have incomes below a certain amount. If you don't want anybody to have income below that certain amount, you give them all a UBI of that certain amount. And that ends poverty by definition. Now, that said, it is possible that you say, well, what if you have it of a different amount? How much will that reduce poverty? So that aspect of poverty is testable. And I should have mentioned that more strongly, but the fact that it's a UBI of a certain design can eliminate poverty is really unquestionable. The question is not whether it can, it's whether we should, is the question there. Now, the freedom claim. If UBI is high enough, you could live without having to take a job. And that gives you a certain kind of freedom. That gives you a lot more options too. If you're a worker with a job and you want to take a sabbatical, UBI is there to do that. It gives you that freedom. If it is high enough, it will give you the power to say no. So it gives you freedom in that sense. Now, questions we could ask is, how high does UBI have to be to do that? There are related questions, yes, but the fact that some UBI can do this is true by definition. Also, the compensation claim. Many UBI supporters, including myself, view UBI as your justly deserved compensation for the fact that a small amount of people control the world's resources, and the rest of us don't. The rest of us at least don't control enough that we can live on it. And I argue that we should tax the people who own resources, give money to people who don't own a sufficient amount of resources in the form of a UBI for everybody. And that as a form of compensation. You pay for what you own, you get paid for what you don't own. So you're always paying for what you own and getting paid otherwise. That is compensation. The fact that UBI can do that is unquestionable. You can take it from people who own the resources of the world and give it to everyone, including the people who don't own the resources of the world. And that you can think of that as compensation. True by definition. The question is, do people deserve that compensation? Not whether, am I right that people deserve that compensation, not whether it can provide that compensation. Now, those four claims are all from the supporter side. But one claim from the opponent side is also true by definition, and that is the reciprocity or the work ethic claim. It is true that UBI allows non-wealthy people to enjoy the fruits of other people's labor without contributing their labor themselves. It is true that if your idea of the work ethic is that everyone must contribute their labor to a joint project unless they're independently wealthy. UBI does, in fact, allow non-wealthy people to do what wealthy people are already doing, at least some of them are already doing, and that is enjoying the fruits of other people's labor without contributing labor themselves. All of those are true by definition. These are some of the most controversial aspects of the UBI debate. These are very much what drives the UBI debate. And we already know that all 5 of them are true. We don't need a test to know them. So what good can tests do with these? Well, there are related things that tests can claim. They can't test any of these 5 things directly, but we can test some things that are related. And that includes what portion of the cost of UBI is efficient? What portion is an efficiency loss? To do this, researchers are going to have to separate the substitution and the income effect of a UBI and the taxes used and at least the taxes used to finance it as they affect net recipients. So that efficiency loss is theoretically observable in an experiment. At least they'll give us some indication of efficiency loss. What is the efficiency loss relative to other policies? What indicators are there of dynamic efficiency? By dynamic efficiency, I mean efficiency cost is, as economists, you all know, you move the supply or the demand curve in a market. People change their behavior because of what you've done, and the part of that is a substitution effect rather than an income effect is considered an efficiency loss. And that is the static efficiency change. But there can be dynamic efficiency gains and losses. That is simply merely initial result. But if you find out that by doing this, we get a healthier, better educated, more trusting workforce, then over the years, if that relieves poverty and that relieves the costs associated with poverty, and it relieves low education and mental illness and the costs associated with those things, that is a dynamic efficiency. So we can look at the efficiency effects of UBI to some extent. Also related to the poverty claim is the claim of how much will a UBI of a given size reduce poverty. If the UBI is lower than the poverty line, then it's not going to relieve the poverty of everybody. And how many people's poverty it eliminates is going to depend on how people respond in their work ethic. And how much it affects the poverty gap is going to be affected by these efforts. So that's something experiments can look at. They're only going to find some indirect answers to it, but they will find it. So what is the relative effectiveness and affordability of using UBI to reduce or eliminate poverty? That's the bottom line question for poverty. If people work less, what will they do with their time? How do the different sides feel about that? Given that we know how different sides feel about the work ethic and freedom issues, how are they using their time? Are they actually using it for another form of labor, like taking care of children, getting educated, trying to start a business or something like that, or to bargain for higher wages? Or are they really using it just for pure laziness? The problem with trying to address those questions is they're morally loaded. That's one reason people tend to leave them out. All right, that's the end of chapter 14. I'm blowing through the chapters here. Does anyone have any questions about chapter 14? This water tastes terrible.
I have a question.
Okay, Anna, what's your question?
On the efficiency claim, So I understand like the logic behind it and why it's not testable, or like why it's not needed to be tested. But is like it necessarily the most efficient benefit in terms of like, if you think about redistribution of surplus, like if there's too much, like if you want to benefit farmers, you can also then give, because they've created a surplus of food, it would be more efficient to redistribute food in that way.
Well, okay, I should have said, that, sorry, I just got to notice my internet is unstable. That is not what you want to hear in the middle of a 2-hour class. That I should have said, your question points out what I should have said, which is UBI statically efficient? UBI has a static efficiency. Now, the question is you're trading off a static inefficiency for a dynamic efficiency. So you're giving people a greater incentive to become farmers, which is, if the market itself is efficient, is inefficient. And that would cause an efficiency loss. However, if the market itself is not efficient, that's going to cause a dynamic efficiency gain. And we shouldn't maybe even count that static inefficiency, because it's based on a failing in the market. So that's true that it is an efficient transfer in the sense that it doesn't make the economy any more inefficient than it is now. And it doesn't make the economy any more efficient in the static sense than it is now. But if we have a bunch of externalities in a bunch of markets that the government is able to recognize, the cost of recognizing, though, is an inefficiency. But if they're able to recognize those costs at a relatively low cost, and then use government taxes or subsidies to counteract those inefficiencies, that might be efficiency increases, whereas UBI is efficiency neutral. Unless poverty has enormous externalities, which I believe it does, then it is dynamically efficiency increasing. So yeah, I wish you'd have asked me this question before I finished the book. The book would be a lot better. I would have explained that much better if you'd have asked me this question 3 years ago. So no thanks to you.
It was a clear answer.
Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Okay. So then in the next chapter, which is chapter 15, I have another long list of claims, still nearly a page, of claims that can't be tested with available techniques. And again, I'm not going to explain all those claims, but I will go through and discuss why some of these claims can't be tested. Some of them can't be tested for simple reasons. The anti-exploitation claim and the exploitation claim are so morally loaded that it seems to me hopeless to try to test those, because there's a million ways you can define the way that a worker could be exploited by their employer, and a million ways that you could define that a worker could be exploited by the net recipient of a transfer like UBI, and all of them are morally loaded. Next is the social equality, that by creating greater economic equality, UBI will lead to greater social equality because it's less stigmatizing, and it can alleviate problems of people having clothes that are so shabby, that they're embarrassed to go into public with, that they can't, homeless people cannot bathe when they need to. They're embarrassed to go into public, get a lot of social, but also kids growing up in ghettos feel socially isolated. People doing low status jobs feel socially isolated. All of those things, UBI can conceivably fight social inequality. However, every single one of those is a community effect. We can't really observe whether UBI, I mean, we can observe whether people dress better, whether they have more stable housing, more access to showers, but we cannot observe whether this really gets them more social respect, or whether it creates greater social dynamism and greater mobility. So we can't capture that. Then the capture claim and reduced capture, corruption, and bureaucracy claims can't be tested because, well, the first one is a community effect. It's being captured by landlords. And reduced capture and corruption is that has to do with the internal workings of the future bureaucracy and the potential future government that would be administering UBI, none of which are observable on a test. Okay, the labor productivity claim, the increased innovation and entrepreneurship claim, and the better working conditions claim. These are all long-term and community effects that really can't be observed in a test. Reduced labor supply is the first step in getting all of these benefits. You can show, well, people have reduced their labor supply. You can say, well, maybe they're getting trained to be more productive, or to be entrepreneurs, or holding out for better working conditions. Whether it will have those results is not something an RCT can show. A saturation experiment might give some indication, but an RCT, not at all. And similar to that, researchers could observe only the first step in the structural disadvantage claim and the dynamic efficiency claim. Does it improve? They can observe whether it improves education, childhood health, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and so on. But whether how these will play out in the long run, it can't observe. And the community effects needed to connect those to dynamic efficiency and the elimination of structural disadvantage, that we won't be able to tell from a short-term test. However, observing the first step can be useful, but we're still a long way from it. Okay, the flexible lifestyle claim, the productive non-labor claim, the gender role reinforcement claim, the degrowth claim, the consumerism claim, and the self-destruction claim. All of these share the following problems. They're difficult to observe, they're morally loaded, and that's not to mention that they involve a lot of community effects and long-term effects. Notice that these keep coming up. The long-term effects, community effects, affect almost all of these. Some of these, it makes them almost entirely unobservable. And others, it simply reduces how much we can understand. Okay, the next one is the economic stimulus claim and the economic impediment claim. These are community effects that we really do not observe. It depends not just on what workers with UBI do, but how the economy reacts to them. And we can't directly observe it in a test. We have to use other info. The shut door claim, that is shutting out immigration. The increased support for redistribution claim, the decreased overall redistribution claim, and the migration claim. That is the claim that we're going to get more migrants, the claim we're going to shut the door to have any migrants, the idea that people are going to demand more redistribution when you have this, or that actually we're going to get decreased overall things when we have this. These are opposite claims, but people say them on both sides. People say these issues. They make these completely contradictory remarks, and a UBI experiment can in no way resolve these agreements. These depend on the behavior of future voters and policymakers. And so it's nothing we can talk about at all. The politically enabled proletarian claim and the bought off proletarian claim. Workers work, now that they have a UBI, they will work harder for social reform because they have the time to do it. And they're not caught up just with surviving. Or the bought off proletarian claim. Oh, we throw some crumbs to the proletarians and then they don't work for more fundamental change. Two, again, polar opposite claims, an empirical issue, something we'd like to know something about, but experiments can tell us pretty much nothing about it. They're morally loaded terms. They involve community and long-term effects, and they really involve a lot of unpredictable related changes that are likely to happen at the same time that we introduce a UBI. So experiment can't capture any of that. But this doesn't mean that experimenters should forget about all these variables. All of these variables, although they're unobservable, they determine how we interpret other variables. And so we need to look at our interpretation of the things we do observe in the text relative to how they affect these things that we can't directly observe in a text. It could be a job for microsimulations. It could be a job for ad hoc qualitative discussion, depending on the variable. But so a decrease in labor effort is the first step towards these supporters' claims. The anti-exploitation claim, the better working conditions claim, the reduced capture claim, the labor productivity claim, the burden on labor claim, the degrowth claim, the anti-consumerism claim, and the politically enabled proletariat. All of those, a decrease in labor effort is the first step to getting all of those good things supporters want. But decrease in labor effort is also the first step into getting these bad things supporters want. More consumerism, exploitation of workers by UBI recipients, gender role reinforcement, and economic impediment. So we have to, when we look at the decline in labor effort, which depending on how you set up the study, you're likely to get. When we look at that, we've got to look at it, how is it likely to affect these variables that the two different sides are very concerned about. If you ignore these effects, if the researchers just report the results and don't say anything about these because we can't directly observe them, people will spin the results as if they're saying something far more conclusive about these effects than they really do. Oh, people worked 1 week a year less. So that means that the lower class is free from unacceptable employment. We're going to get much better wages and working conditions. Well, actually, no, it doesn't say that. It might not be enough to have that effect. We do not know. Okay, that is the end of chapter 15.